I would like to invite our next speaker, Helen, School of Agriculture, Food and Rural Development, Newcastle University of Food. Helen, you're welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me here to speak today. I'm here to present on behalf of the Food and Society Group at Newcastle University. I am here in the absence of Professor Lynn, who sent her apologies that she couldn't make the meeting today. So I hope I managed to capture everything that she would have presented to you today. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about developing a research agenda for existing and emerging food safety risks. As Hans has already alluded to, the University of Newcastle are engaged with the Cloud Safety Project. We are part of Work Package 1 and we're conducting a Delphi survey to establish this. Okay, so I wanted to provide you with a very brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cloud for Safety project and Work Package 1, which is global mapping of food safety. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance and why it's important to ensure global food safety as a way of kind of contextualizing the presentation. I'm going to draw on the conclusions of the Go Global project because the Cloud for Safety project is built on the conclusions of the Go Global project, and particularly the Delphi methodology is built on that. I'm going to briefly run through the Delphi technique, and Hans has done a very good job at introducing that to you this morning. And I'm going to talk about how we apply the Delphi technique in the Cloud for Safety project. And before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about food security and why it's important for us to consider the safety of food. As we can see from this FAO definition, safe food is an integral part of food security, and that's why we're going to be considering it today. Okay. So thinking about Newcastle's involvement in the Cloud for Safety project, we are leading Work Package 1, which aims to map international research, innovation, training activities and policy in the area of food safety and identify gaps in knowledge which are salient to policy development. We're conducting a Delphi to do this, and the Delphi is particularly interested in looking at duplication of effort and the harmonisation regarding existing research practices. We're looking at gaps in international research and training needs. We're looking at critical success factors and also the identification of barriers to effective policy translation. And we're also looking at the identification of emerging issues which have regulatory or legal implications. So as I've already said, we're going to be conducting a Delphi survey, and the reason we're doing that is to ensure the involvement of global experts within the survey. The work builds on the Go Global project, as I've already said, and the first stage of this was a scoping workshop which was held in Brussels, and the idea of the scoping workshop was to identify issues for inclusion within the Delphi survey. We were looking particularly at issues that were driving the control and mitigation of emerging food risks, and we were also looking at knowledge gaps with respect to existing and emerging food safety risks. We're talking a lot about emerging food safety risks, and I'm probably telling you something that you already know, but I just wanted to clarify the definition that we were using and what we actually mean by an emerging food safety risk. So we define emerging food safety risk as an unanticipated risk that occurs accidentally or naturally, as well as those arising from deliberate food fraud or acts of malevolence. Emerging food risks are not necessarily new, they don't have to be new risks, but they have always represented a threat, but have only recently been identified. So this is the definition that Newcastle was using. So I now wanted to think a little bit about putting this into context. So why is getting food safety right important? What's the importance of this? The main importance is that getting food safety wrong has considerable consequences. It has considerable economic consequences, as this example shows. So in 2011 there was a severe E. coli outbreak in Germany which killed 16 people. and the German authorities blamed the Spanish cucumbers for causing this outbreak, which led to considerable loss of crops and considerable economic impact of the Spanish agricultural industry. And then Germany later admitted actually that it wasn't the fault of the German cucumbers, it was actually the fault of these bean sprouts. So it has significant economic costs. It can also impact significantly on consumer trust. It can spark emotional consumer responses, which are often heightened by the media representation of crises. So this is an example that happened in the UK in 2010, where meat from a cloned cow purchased from America entered the UK food supply chain. And consumers, as you can imagine, were not particularly happy about this. Another more recent and topical and EU-wide example is the example of Horsegate. So this was where pig DNA was found, horse and pig DNA was found in products that were sold in beef. This impacted significantly on consumer trust, but also had significant economic impacts. It significantly damaged some of the UK's largest food retailers and left consumers wondering whether they could trust the food supply chain in general. So it wasn't a food safety issue per se, but it did highlight significant issues around fraud and standards, issues in food control standards. This was particularly of importance to the UK consumer as it happened to the beef supply chain, and post-BSE, consumers expect the beef supply chain to be incredibly tight. So public concern was centred around this idea that there was systemic criminality happening within the food supply chain, and producers were out for illegal economic gain. So again, it significantly damaged trust. It also highlighted the issue of bute and drug residues within meat products. Food safety risks also have significant environmental consequences. Dioxins are a particular example of this. So dioxins are persistent environmental contaminants. They accumulate significantly in the food supply chain and cause 90% of human exposure to dioxins is through food. And some of the recent scandals are just listed here. They've related particularly to feed supply chains. So as I said, the Cloud for Safety Web Package 1 is built on the methodological insights gained from the Go Global project. And some conclusions from the Go Global project highlighted that political will to engage in emerging food risk identification and management may be problematic. They also identified a need to keep the issues on international and national research agendas. And this could be achieved through effective stakeholder engagement. And also, we needed to improve the effectiveness of sharing data across expert communities, and that activity needed to be supported globally. And ultimately, it suggested that we needed to have much more joined up global policy, which is where the Lab for Safety project is. So when we're talking about existing and emerging threats, what are we actually talking about? Some of the food chain contaminants that we can find are microbiological, relating to pathogens such as Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter, Listeria, for example. It's also around veterinary drug residues, so the overuse of antibiotics in farming practices, which can build up antibiotic resistance. Issues such as heavy metal contaminants in food, the unintended presence of nanoparticles and also GMOs, and also the unintended inclusion of toxic ingredients, so for example Japanese star anise. Other such food chain contaminants include dioxins, secondary metabolites, mycotoxins, and infectious animal diseases. So when asked during the Delphi survey, in the Go Global project, global experts rated these as the most significant global threats. They were microbiological, they were chemical, relating to globalization of food supply chains, the control and regulation of food supply chains, mycotoxins, and crime and fraud, and also to do with technology. But they also found that technology was also a solution to mitigate food safety problems. That was a mixed response. So the final conclusions from the Global project suggested that capacity and capability building regarding emerging food safety risk identification and management needed to be included in the development agendas for donor countries and institutions, and deviations from global rules may be acceptable for products destined for local use via a tiered system of approval. But a formal framework for dealing with national regional exceptions in global rules really needed to be developed. This is where the Go Global project stopped. They didn't identify gaps in evidence or identification of policy requirements, and this is what the Collab for Safety Delphi was intended to do. So building on the Go Global, insights from Go Global, and also building on insights from the scoping workshop, the initial scoping workshop, we developed a list of drivers that were going to be tested within the Delphi, within the Collab for Safety Delphi. These included drivers such as demographic change, economic driving forces, technological advances, geopolitical driving forces, changes in societal values, malevolent activities, which the horse signified, increases in the complexity and the size of the supply chain, resource shortages, food risk representation in the media, which was highlighted, and water security. So what I also wanted to consider was how a driver then causes a potential food safety hazard. And if we take the example of the global recession, we can see that this has significant likelihood of increasing potential for food fraud, which was highlighted by the horse meat scandal. It also has implications for domestic storage, so at a consumer level, the way that consumers are handling and storing their food, potentially storing foods for longer than is recommended. It also conflicts between messages around sustainability use and also safe use, so the consumers left with conflicting messages. So just thinking about how we identify existing food safety risks, there are global mechanisms in place for identifying existing food safety risks, for example, the International Food Safety Authorities Network and the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, and also the Global Information Early Warning Systems. But as researchers, what we really need to question is how effective are these combined systems at present? Where are the gaps? Are there any gaps that can be identified? And are there any associated capacity building needs? Where can we improve? If we take the example of food fraud, we can see that some of the emerging research needs are to do with understanding the motivations behind food fraud and the identification of vulnerable links in the food chain. So where are we vulnerable to food fraud? And this can be associated with regulatory variation, temporal variation, geographic variation in region, and variation in economic motivation. We also have research gaps in developing predictive models to detect fraud. We could do with developing a database of methods, so a RASSF like notification system of detected fraud. We also need to work on risk-based sampling systems and also new technologies for detection and identification of adulteration, particularly with the geographical origin of foods. In terms of capacity building, we need to think about training in detection and prevention methods. We also need to think about training in risk identification and developing of the sampling strategies to identify fraud. We also need to think about evidence for policy development, things around the estimates of its extent and effects within the food chain, so how systemic is fraud within the food chain. We need to think about national, EU and international policy risk assessment and management and communication. In terms of national gaps, we could be thinking about harmonisation of international approaches to deal with food fraud, so making sure there is greater harmonisation across national boundaries, and we also need to think about global analysis and sharing of data. So going back to the Collab for Safety Delphi, the Delphi was particularly interested in the duplication of effort and lack of harmonisation regarding existing research practices. We were looking at gaps in international research and training needs. We were looking at critical success factors and the identification of barriers to these, and emerging food safety issues and their legal implications. So what is a Delphi? So I think Hans has already explained a little bit about what we mean by a Delphi technique, but just to reiterate, a Delphi is a foresight technique. It's aimed at the development of international consensus regarding risk. It can be on any topic, but in this instance, it was about risk assessment and risk management activities with respect to emerging food safety risks. So to define what we mean specifically by Delphi, so Delphi is a procedure to obtain the most reliable consensus of opinion amongst experts. It's usually gained by eliciting expert opinion by a series of intensive questionnaires, and it's interdispersed with controlled feedback. So you run a questionnaire, you then give the participants feedback on their responses, and then you repeat the process. Typically, these surveys are internet-based, which means that we can get a wide range of geographically dispersed experts. The responses are always anonymous, so they can feel free to express whatever opinion they have or hold, however controversial it may be. The main advantages is that it allows the inclusion of many geographically dispersed experts, so we all know that it's very, very difficult to get experts to attend workshops or meetings. We're very, very busy and we don't want to give up our time to do that, so the Delphi is one approach to bypass that. It also preempts difficulties with group meetings, so for example having more dominant speakers or more dominant voices within the group discussion. So the first round of the Delphi is usually to flag up important issues for follow-up, so the list of drivers that we were discussing, they were tested in the initial round for us. And then the second round focuses more specifically on issues that are highlighted as being highly relevant. It also aims to quantify difference in opinion amongst experts and provide feedback on the view of others, so they can then change their opinion if they need to. So for the Collab for Safety Delphi, we used the database that was developed by SPI. There were approximately, at the point of designing the Delphi questionnaire, there was 1,000 experts on that list. I think it's considerably more now. And we approached 500 experts for inclusion within the Delphi. We based selection on expertise, also country and region, and also organisational background of the expert. And the survey was administered online, although if experts wanted, and to increase reach, we also provided a Word document of the questionnaire, and that could be gained on request. So again, building on the recommendations of the Go Global project, we translated the Delphi survey into the following languages: English, Chinese, Russian, Portuguese, French and Dutch, with the help of our collaborators, which we were very grateful for. We looked particularly in the first round at existing and emerging food risks, existing and emerging policy requirements, research needs and gaps, capability and capacity building, and also expert uncertainty. So we were asking experts to rate how certain they were that the drivers were going to cause problems in the future. So the data was collected between December and January 2014. In total, we got 106 surveys back, which was usable data, which we were quite pleased with. There was 52 countries represented in total in the Delphi survey, and all of the continents were represented by expert opinion response. The average age of the experts was 36 to 45. We had a significant male bias in the sample, which I guess is to be expected, with 70% male responses and 30% female. And like the Go Global project, we had a bias towards European expert responses. I should just give you a very brief update on where we are with the Delphi at the moment. So the data's currently being analysed. We've compiled the feedback for the experts that's about to go out, and that's why I'm not presenting any major results, because the feedback hasn't been sent out yet. And we're expecting to launch the second round over summer, which should be finishing the Delphi mid-summer time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Helen. Have everybody to rest.